Hey everybody, what's up and welcome back. So, if you're new here, hey, what's up? My name is Liz and welcome to Creating Crime Time. I am your host where I talk about a true crime story and occasionally I create a piece of, like a work of art at the same time. So if you're interested and want to stay around, subscribe and turn your notification bell on to all, and let's dive into our next day of 25 days of true crime. I don't know what that was, but I hope you enjoyed it. So, today's case is about the Connecticut River Valley killer. So this is an unidentified serial killer. Ooh. So I grew up hearing about this case, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record about hearing about certain cases, but I literally grew up hearing about this case. So this was a series of murders around Claremont, New Hampshire and the Connecticut River Valley, and this happened in the 80s. Primarily in the 80s. The actual span of crimes they believe is from 1978 to 1987. There's also many different names for this serial killer. He's also called the New Hampshire serial killer, the Kellyville killer, the Valley killer, whether it is a man, whether it is a woman. In the mid-80s, three young women disappeared, and this was around Claremont. In 1985 and 1986, the skeletal remains of two of the women were recovered within 1,000 feet of each other near a wooded area in Kellyville, New Hampshire. Now, the condition of the remains made the cause of death very difficult to determine, and but certain factors pointed to multiple stab wounds. So again, if you're not familiar with stuff like this, there could have been an infliction, like here's a bone and there's a ridge, a sharp ridge into it, indicating that there could have been potentially there was stab wounds in the flesh above the skeletal remains, because once it goes through the skin, it can puncture your bones. It leaves identifying markers, stuff like that. I promise I'm a morbid person, but I'm not a serial killer. I just like true crime. Between the recoveries of the first body and the second body, a 36-year-old woman was stabbed to death in a severely frenzied attack inside of her home in Saxton's River, Vermont. So this is the only one that's outside of it. It's still within the Connecticut River Valley area, but it's not in New Hampshire. 10 days later, they would find the remains of a third missing woman, and the autopsy again revealed that there was evidence of multiple stab wounds. So here is 4 people. One was stabbed in a frenzied attack, and then the other 3 show signs of multiple stab wounds. At this point, investigators began examining prior homicides in the area, and they found 2 previous cases, 1978 and in 1981. This further reinforced their need to investigate and that there was a serial killer in the area. And at the peak of the investigation, after additional homicides had occurred, and one non-fatal attack, investigators noted that there was a similarity in an MO. If you don't know what an MO is, it's something that serial killers have. So if they have a specific type, there's a specific way they kill people. If they have a specific design to how they do it, how the bodies are, where the remains are found, stuff like that. It's a signature MO that a serial killer has. Or if there's other crimes that you commit, there's an MO that goes along with it. Often it was dump sites that were used where the bodies were found, and there's specific wound patterns that linked many of the murders together, noting that there was a common perpetrator. So on October 24th of 1978, a 27-year-old named Kathy Milliken, she was born on May 25th in 1951. She was photographing birds at the Chandler Brook Wetland Preserve in New London. Unfortunately, the next day, her body would be discovered with at least 29 stab wounds. And her body was found just a few yards away from where she was last seen. Now, on the 25th of July in 1981, 37-year-old Elizabeth Critchley, she was a student from the University of Vermont. She disappeared near Interstate 91 at the Mass and Vermont border, where she was last seen hitchhiking in Waterbury, Vermont. Or she was trying to hitchhike to Waterbury, Vermont. On August 9th, her body would be discovered in a wooded area off of the Unity Stage Road in Unity, New Hampshire. Due to the condition of her remains, the medical examiner was unable to determine a cause of death because of the severity of the condition of her remains. So, the next victim in this case is a 16-year-old nurse's aide named Bernice Courtemanche, and she was last seen by her boyfriend's mother in Claremont on May 30th of 1984. She was thought to have gone out to see her boyfriend in Newport by hitchhiking along New Hampshire Route 12, but she didn't reach her destination and she was reported missing. So she went missing in May of 1984. Her remains would be discovered in April of 1986 by a fisherman who just stumbled upon them. Forensics examined her remains and uncovered evidence of knife wounds to the neck and an injury to the head. So the injuries had kind of escalated. Another thing to know about serial killers is their first few murders, after the first few, they get more comfortable and they want to add to the way that they kill. So other things are introduced. Blunt force trauma is one, whether there's like a sexual nature to the crime, different things like that. Their MO kind of alters. They'll add in little bits here and there, but they'll still have their signature MO, so multiple stab wounds. And now adding in trauma to the head is something that an escalation might have happened. Maybe that Bernice tried to fight and the person that killed her just got super pissed and injured her head, then went into the stabbing. There's so many different, because of like statistically thinking, there's so many different ways that these crimes could be committed and so many different variables that go with it. A few months later, 20th of July 1984, 27-year-old Ellen Fried, she was a supervising nurse at Valley Regional Hospital. She made a late night stop at a payphone in Claremont. She spoke to her sister for approximately an hour, and then suddenly she said that there was a strange car she'd observed driving back and forth in the vicinity. So she stepped away from the phone briefly to make sure her car engine would start and then returned. So after a few more minutes of talking, she ended her phone call. The next day, she failed to report to work and her car was found abandoned on Jarvis Road, which was a few miles away from the market where she used the payphone. Her remains were found in a wooded area near the banks of Sugar River in Kellyville in September of 1985. Post-mortem examination revealed evidence of multiple stab wounds and a possible sexual assault. So now he's escalated to a possible sexual step of his assault on these victims. July 10th of 1985, a 27-year-old single mother, Eva Morse, she was born on the 6th of May of 1958. She was last seen hitchhiking near the border of Claremont and Charlestown. This is on Route 12 as well. This was the last time anybody had seen her alive, and after this she was reported missing. 1986. Her remains were found by loggers about 500 feet where Critchley's body was found in 1981. So when they examined her, they found stab wounds in her neck. Her stab wounds were very similar to Bernice Courtemanche, where Bernice had stab wounds in her neck. Same thing happened with Eva Morse. She had stab wounds in her neck. Our next victim on April 15th of 1986, Linda Moore. She was seen doing yard work outside of her home in Saxton's River, Vermont. And this is just a short distance from the I-91, so our Interstate 91. Unfortunately, that evening, her husband returned home to find his wife dead. She had multiple stab wounds. The crime scene had suggested that it was quite the struggle that happened before her demise. Her numerous witnesses reported seeing a slightly stocky, dark-haired man with a blue backpack lingering near her home that day. And so description of this man is that he was between the ages of 20 to 25. He was completely clean shaven. He had a somewhat round face, so indicating he was younger. He wore dark rimmed glasses. And that following year is when they released their first composite sketch of who they believed their killer was. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the last victim in this case. We have another victim. Her name is Barbara Agnew. On January 10th of 1987, a 38-year-old nurse, which is Barbara Agnew, she was returning from a skiing outing in Stratton, Vermont, but she would never fully make it home. That evening, a snowplow driver encountered her green BMW that was headed northbound on the I-91 rest stop, and the car was at a rest stop, and this is in Hartford, Vermont. The doors cracked open and there was blood on the steering wheel, indicating something had happened. Just 2 months later, on March 28th of 1987, her body was found near an apple tree in Heartland, Vermont. She had been stabbed to death. There was a heavy snowstorm in the area during the night of her disappearance, and she was about 10 miles from her home, so they don't really know why she pulled into the rest stop. I mean, it's really like thrown investigators for a loop ever since her disappearance, and until they discovered her, they still are very like confused as to why she stopped. I think that maybe there was somebody off the side of the road and she pulled into the rest stop to help them, but unfortunately that person might have been her killer. I mean, it's a thought, right? It's just so there is one attack that is associated with this case, and that's Jane Boroski. So the killings had stopped, and this was after Jane Boroski was attacked. So on the evening of August 6th of 1988, 22-year-old Jane Boroski, now mind you, she was 7 months pregnant at the time. She was returning from a county fair in Keene, so Keene State Fair, when she stopped at a convenience store in West Swansea to purchase soda. And when she returned to her car, she noticed that there was a Jeep Wagoneer parked next to her. And through her rearview mirror, she saw the driver of that vehicle walking around the back of her vehicle. He then approached her window, asked her if the payphone was working, and at which he immediately grabbed her, pulled her from the vehicle. She struggled, and the man accused her of beating up his girlfriend and asked if she had mass plates on her car. So Jane responded that she had New Hampshire plates, but this didn't stop him from attacking her. He proceeded to stab her 27 times before he drove away, leaving her to die. So this didn't kill her. She managed to return to her car, and she drove on New Hampshire Route 32 to a friend's house for help. And as she neared the house, she noticed a vehicle driving in front of her and realized that it was her attacker's Jeep, like she was driving behind him. Barosky finally reached her friend's house, and at which the occupants, the friends at the house, immediately came out to help her because, I mean, she's been stabbed 32 times and 27 times, sorry. She's been stabbed 27 times and she's 7 months pregnant. Like, She then noticed that her attacker performed a U-turn and slowly passed by the house where she was before speeding away. Thankfully, Jane was able to be treated at the hospital, and it had determined that the attack resulted in a severed jugular vein, 2 collapsed lungs, a kidney laceration, severed tendons in her knees and her thumb. Her baby did survive. Obviously, baby did have complications. Daughter would be eventually diagnosed with cerebral palsy, but they both survived this vicious attack. And Boroski was able to provide the authorities with a sketch of the man who attacked her and the first 3 characters of the license plate. But what had happened is that these killings had stopped and the case became cold. I think that when the perpetrator attacked Jane, it spooked him, and because she's seen this person, knows the license plate, saw them at face view, and after, with the pulling of the Yui around to drive back around from the house where he saw her pull into the driveway, like, now people could potentially find out who he is. I think that spooked him, so he just stopped. Or he died. It's possible. Or he was arrested on another charge. Like, there is other possible victims in this case, because they don't really know the amount of victims associated with the Connecticut Valley River killer. There's no actual, like, definitive number. The other possible victims of this case are Joan Dunham. She was 14. So with her, she was sexually assaulted and strangled on the 11th of June in 1968 in Charleston, New Hampshire. So she was linked because of geographically where she was. Because of where she was and how close she is to the other victims, that's why she has been linked to this case. On October 5th, 1982, 76-year-old Sylvia Gray was found bludgeoned and stabbed to death in a wooded area. Now, this was like a few hundred yards away from her Plainfield, New Hampshire home, and she was found a day after she was reported missing. There is one male involved in this case, and his name is Stephen Hill. He was 38 years old. He was last seen on the 20th of June in 1986 after getting his paycheck from his employer in Lebanon, New Hampshire. So on July 15th, just about a month later, his body was found with multiple stab wounds in Heartland across the Connecticut River from where Sylvia Gray's body had been found 4 years earlier. So there's bodies that are just like across from each other in very close proximity. So that's why they believe that these victims are connected. On June 24th, 1988, there was decomposed body parts consisting of arms and legs belonging to a woman found dumped along Mass Route 78, so Massachusetts State Route 78 in Warwick, Mass. And this was less than a mile from the New Hampshire border. The entire body is believed to have been dismembered. The head and torso have never been found and are believed to have been disposed elsewhere. Investigators have ruled the death a homicide. The victim is being described as being white, average height, athletic body type. The identity is still unknown in regards to these remains, and it remains unsolved at this point. So the last possible victim that is associated with this case is another 14-year-old young girl. And on the 25th of July of 1989, a 14-year-old Carrie Moss of New Boston left her parents' home to visit friends in Goffstown, and she just disappeared. Exactly 2 years later, almost fully 2 years later, so the 24th of July of 1991, her skeletal remains were found in a wooded area in New Boston, and her cause of death couldn't be determined because of the state of her remains, but it is thought that she was a victim of homicide. So this case has a lot of different discrepancies when it comes to, well, not really like discrepancies, but different MOs and styles of killing when it comes to this actual, like, whoever the actual perp is. There is 2 people that have kind of like been associated with this case. One did a deathbed confession, which was like breaking news when it happened. So the first suspect is Delbert Tallman. So Delbert Tallman, so let's just get into kind of like how and when they believe he is a suspect. So on the 20th of May of 1984, 16-year-old Heidi Martin went for a jog in Heartland, Vermont. So here's Heartland again. It's another geographic area that is attributed to this case. Also, it's in 1984, so this is within the span of crimes. She went for a jog on Martinsville Road. The next day, her body had been found in a swampy area behind the elementary school of town. She had been raped and stabbed to death. So Delbert, who was 21 at the time, confessed to the crime and he had been tried for it. But he later recanted his story in his confession and he was acquitted. Nearly 3 years later, Barbara Agnew, her body was found approximately a mile away from where Heidi Martin's body was found. So Delbert had resided in Bellows Falls, Springfield, and also in Windsor, Vermont. And he had also lived in Claremont, which was the center of these killings. He was convicted in 1996 on 2 counts of lewd and lascivious conduct with a child, and he was incarcerated in Lake County Prison in Florida for a failure to comply with child offender registry, sex offender registry requirements. He was released in October of 2010 because of the circumstances of Martin's death and the information relating to the arrest and trial. Some websites cite her death as being unsolved and part of the killings, but there's no evidence really like tying her murder to the killings and saying that Tallman is involved because he was acquitted, so technically he is not proven guilty, still really innocent. So another person that is suspected in this case is Gary Westover. Now, in October of 1997, he's 46 years old, a paraplegic man named Gary Westover. Now, his uncle was a retired sheriff of Grafton County. His name is Howard Minnan, and he said to his uncle that he has something to confess. So Gary told Howard that in 1987, 3 buddies picked him up from what he had described as a night of partying. And allegedly, they loaded Gary in his wheelchair into their van and set out to Vermont, and where they abducted, murdered, and dumped Barbara Agnew, which was the Connecticut River Valley's final victim. Gary provided names of the 3 friends, and after Minnan shared Gary's information with his wife and his daughter and the rest of law enforcement, which, why would you share that with your wife and your daughter? I would just go straight to the actual active cops after hearing stuff like that. However, Howard felt that authorities weren't interested in any of this information, and Gary ultimately died in March of 1998, and Howard died in 2006. So, also in the same year, one of Gary's aunts wrote to Anne Agnew, which is the 6th sister of Barbara, and with the information that was originally given by Gary to Howard. And what happened is that Anne ended up forwarding the letter to a man named Carty, and who ended up running a business. And this person knew the family. So basically, what happened is that after they forwarded the letter, they noticed that the names sounded familiar that were involved in what Gary was trying to confess to. Those 2, Carty and Anne, believe that the authorities are already in the possession of those names that Gary had provided to Howard, and they further just speculated that may have been acquainted with Cardi at the time at the local VA hospital, although none of this has been confirmed, and this case still remains unsolved. So they believe that they all knew, basically, just to put it in a nutshell, is that the names sounded familiar, but there's nothing that really like can tie it all together. Yeah, so this case is really like, it's really haunted New Hampshire, like this whole area, because obviously it's an unidentified serial killer. I mean, there's not a lot of those, other than if you think about like